Welcome to 66 Verses That Explain the Bible. I'm Esau McCauley, host of the Esau McCauley podcast on the Holy Post Network. What we do in this series is we're choosing one passage from every book of the Bible and speaking about what that passage reveals about God and his purposes for the world. Today, we're at the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy is the last of what is often known as the Torah or the law or the five books of Moses. And in the narrative of scripture, the book of Deuteronomy happens after Israel has spent 40 years in the wilderness. And most of the generation who had seen the Exodus and who had seen God's mighty deliverance are now dead. And the people of Israel are on the verge of entering into a promised land. They're about to experience a new reality. And before they enter that new reality, within the context of Deuteronomy, God has Moses basically give the law again. He retells them the same set of laws and issues that the first generation of people had when they first left Egypt. And so what Deuteronomy does is it prepares people for life in the place that God has created them. Yes, God has rescued them. He's brought them out of slavery, but he's also giving them a life or a picture of a life to live in their freedom. One of the interesting things then that you take from Deuteronomy before we even get to one of these verses is there's a difference between simply freedom, right? The freedom from oppressive context and the actual life that we live before God. And that we need as Christians and as believers, both of these things. Liberation from our sin, liberation from oppressive structures, but also a picture of life with God. And the passage I want to talk to you today deals with one of the practices that God wanted his people to engage in once they got into the promised land. And the promised land is supposed to be this place of material abundance. Everybody had food and everything was going to be perfect. If you read any of the stories or the accounts, both of the promises made to Abraham and the promises that occur in the book of Exodus, that they're going to come into a land flowing with milk and honey, where there's going to be food and abundance. Everything's going to be like a barbecue and a cookout. But there's also this idea that this might not be true for everyone. And this is from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 and following. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains to the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest your grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the grapes again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. So one of the things that is at least interesting to learn from here is we can assume that just because people in the promised land, there's going to be no suffering. But what God seems to know is that even in a world of abundance, there's always someone who is left out of that abundance. What are the people of God supposed to do in this context? What Moses is trying to get the people to understand here is the goal is not to maximize profits. So if they were gleaning and they said, oh, here's another thing that I can take, and I can take some of the grapes that fell to the ground, or I can take some of the sheep that fell to the ground, and so I can maximize profit or resources for myself. That I can have this idea that the main thing that I need to do is provide for myself and my family. And what God is saying through this passage here is that actually your job is not to maximize things for you, but to actually be inefficient for the sake of those who are suffering. And in particular, he has in mind the foreigner who has no relatives or people who might care about them in Israel. The person who is fatherless or a widow, the person who might have had someone who cared about them because of personal tragedy, they are now in a place of destitution. And there's a reason. There's a reason he gives them to do this. Why might the people who are now in the promised land have compassion for people who are from radically different circumstances than them? And he says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. In other words, Israel's past experience of oppression was supposed to create a sense of empathy that influenced how they saw the rest of the suffering peoples of the world. Now, by this time in the narrative, or pretty shortly into Israel's history, there's actually no one alive who directly remembers their period of slavery. That generation is actually gone. But he's saying, I want you to remember that as part of your story. And so at the foundation of the story of the people of God is this idea that we ourselves know from our own story what it means to suffer. And because of that suffering, when we see other people who are suffering, it's supposed to call to mind the time when God has rescued us in the past. And so at the center of this then is this ability to empathize with the people who are suffering. Now, as this relates to the Christian, it's kind of similar. That every single person who ever becomes a child of God found themselves without the resources they needed to save themselves. None of us can save ourselves. And God looked at us as helpless and in need, and he came and rescued us. And when we reflect upon God's rescue of us, it ought to create in us a certain set of empathy towards the people who are also in need of rescue, both materially and spiritually. And so what people are supposed to see when they see the suffering is not these are people who deserve it, or these are people who are not a part of my family, so I'm not responsible for them. But these are people who are in need of the same grace that I have received. Now, some people might be tempted to say, well, this is from the Torah and it's not, the Christians aren't under the law, so we don't have to follow these direct gleaning rules that we have here. And that might be fine enough. But I want to ask this question. Out of all the ways that God could have chosen to form a people, he formed the people by liberating them from slavery. And he used that liberation as the basis for their ethical reasoning. Therefore, I do not think it is inappropriate in any context to say, we are also the people who are part of that story. The scriptural story of God's liberating activity leading to empathy is the heritage of the Christian. And so when we see those who are suffering, like the ancient Israelites, we reflect God's own compassion when we care for them in ways that might not be inefficient for us, but are beneficial to them. That has been 66 verses that explain the Bible, the book of Deuteronomy. Thank you for listening.